Good morning. My name is Jeffrey Haas, and I'm really honored to be here with you. I was with an organization called the People's Law Office in Chicago, and I was one of the lawyers that pursued the civil rights case on behalf of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark's families. And so I just wondered, I know, Elaine, in your book, and I know, David, you've mentioned, but I wondered here if you all would, I'd just like to have those of you who knew Fred Hampton could say a few words about him and also about the role of COINTELPRO, both in creating or playing up the animosity between United Slaves and the Panthers on the West Coast. And of course, in Chicago, we think it was COINTELPRO, we know it was, that actually caused the raid that murdered Fred Hampton. But I'd be interested in what you know about him. I'm trying to write a book, a biography of Fred Hampton and his murder and so forth.
I'm going to defer that to Elaine and then back that up. But tomorrow, I'd like to mention that there's going to be a panel on exactly your question, because we're showing the murder of Fred Hampton, and Billy Brooks, Che Brooks, who was the third person in leadership in that Chicago chapter, will be here to talk about that. But Elaine and I had the honor, the purpose, the first occasion, and this is the only time that Fred Hampton ever left Chicago. Elaine and I brought him from Chicago to UCLA to speak, and sometime thereafter he was assassinated. But I'll let Elaine talk a bit about that, and I'll follow up, sure.
Well, but I want to say something about the so-called United Slaves. I never knew the US organization, did you, to be called the United Slaves? I thought that was something that was invented.
It was later.
Yeah, other people called it that. Us meant us or them. But COINTELPRO, I mean, has to be distinguished between just outright murder of people like Fred Hampton, because COINTELPRO was a way to undermine, discredit, disrupt, destroy the party through a variety of other kinds of machinations, so that, for example, a lawyer like you, many lawyers didn't support us, they would try to get your bar card or try to get you disbarred. That would be part of what COINTELPRO would do. Or they would write us a letter and say, you know, he's really an FBI informant. That was a hard one to overcome. They would write us and then when I say they, the FBI would generate these letters. And certainly they helped to promote a distinction or a difference between us organization and the Panthers, but one cannot one cannot take away from what was acted upon by the members of the US organization, as though they were puppets of some kind of the, if they did the work for the FBI, they did it without getting paid, as far as I'm concerned, and maybe should have been. But in any case, that was a separate thing. That, yes, certainly there was, that was part of it, but there was disruption and attempts, and people think there were a lot of informants. I'm one person who disagrees that there were a lot of informants in the Black Panther Party. I think that that was part of what COINTELPRO did, is to create the image that half the people were informants. It's not true. There were police agents that attempted to form chapters of the party in the early days. It was so hard to be a member of the Black Panther Party, it's hard for me to imagine that somebody could stay more than 10 minutes and be a full-time FBI agent reporting into, you know, the headquarters and all this kind of imagery. But that being said, we don't know, because what we have is this record and that record, and so most of those are obliterated, names are taken out, things are changed around and so forth. I've attempted to get my records again, and the first time I had them in the party, I had over 12,000 pages or something ridiculous like that, and when I went back for 10 years, they didn't even have 600 pages available. So just going to show you, that stuff gets written out. Now, as for Fred Hampton, I think that Fred Hampton, for those of us who did have the honor to meet and talk with Fred, it was an amazing, I mean, I hate to use that word because it's so overused, but it was just so, he was such an incredible man. You absolutely forgot that he was only 21 years old when he was assassinated. But we went there, unfortunately, David took me, just on a personal note, took me with him to Chicago that night, because we had just gone to he had come down for the funeral of Walter Touré Pope, who was a member of the Southern California chapter of the Black Panther Party, who had been murdered by the police. And so that funeral took place in October of 1969. And so David, and I was feeling very depressed, and a bunch of other things were going on, and he said, well, why don't you just come on with me? I'm going to see Fred Hampton. And I really didn't think it was important at that moment. There was a debate between Fred Hampton and Eldridge Cleaver that was going on about the Weather Underground and so forth, and Fred Hampton was taking it very hard line, and David was going to find out what were the problems and try to resolve them. And actually did an incredible job, which is a piece of the history that some people don't like to discuss. But in any case, Fred had a very principled position, and it was a difficult moment. But while we were there, I was pregnant at the time, and so was Fred's wife, with little Fred, who's not so little anymore, but we all still call him little Fred. And so there was no place for us to sleep because Fred never slept anywhere, but somebody had just bought Fred that big bed. And so Deborah and I slept in that bed while David and the men debated all night long about the principle of this, the rightness of this. And at 7 o'clock in the morning, everybody got up, or at least the two of us got up, and everybody was still awake. And Fred Hampton had all of these people out on the schoolyard getting ready to start the breakfast program. And in Chicago, this is a serious thing to be participating. It's one thing to be in the breakfast program in L.A. and get up and the sun is shining, you know, all year round. It's another to go to the breakfast program in Chicago when it's, you know, 0 below zero, you know, and talk about cooking some breakfast and getting some eggs and all that. And Chicago had one of the best breakfast programs among the chapters. In any case, they would get up in the morning and Fred would get everybody excited, and he would just say that wonderful thing. He would say, all right, I'm gonna live for the people. They say, live for the people. I'm gonna die for the people. I'm gonna die for the people because I love the people, power to the people. Oh my God, we couldn't believe it. Young thug-looking men, boys, women, young 18, 17-year-olds, 20-year-olds, learning to read, getting up to cook breakfast for their sisters and young sisters and brothers. I had never seen anything like it. We knew this stuff, but I never saw anybody articulate with such power and such conviction. And so Fred agreed to come to Los Angeles, and we had a moment to talk about the death of John and Bunchy. And it was in November now of '69. And Masai Hewitt, who was the Minister of Education of the party, I was supposed to speak there, and I couldn't go and speak because I was too overwhelmed by what had happened at UCLA and the deaths of John and Bunchy. And so Masai was supposed to speak, and then he couldn't speak. And so Fred said, and we said, well, will you speak? And he did, and we sat there as though we were members of the audience and had never heard any of this. This man had a power of speech and an articulation and a power to organize. And why was he killed? It wasn't just because he could speak. It was because you had, like Bunchy Carter, he could go to the Peace Stone Nation in Jeff Fort, right? And he could go to the NAACP over here. And he had Slim Coleman, the Young Patriots over here. And he had the real Rainbow Coalition going on in Chicago. Fred Hampton had to be eliminated because he was bringing together too many people around the questions of oppression, around the question of revolution. And I want to just end by saying, well, the other thing Fred used to say was, he says, we want black power for black people, brown power for brown people, yellow power for yellow people, red power for red people, white power for white people, and Panther power to the vanguard. And I used to love that.